Drag Across Concrete, starring Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn. It's a tough, gritty, and brutal crime film, a sort of modern anti-Western, I would say, especially when you consider that there are really no heroes in this particular story. And the story is this: a pair of cops get suspended for the way they brutally mistreat a suspect during a drug bust. They're sent off home for a couple of weeks with no pay. They both have personal issues which require addressing, which you may have guessed will require money. So they end up hatching this plan to use their suspension and stake out a known underworld criminal from out of town that came in for a couple of days. The cops hope that they can bust him during a drug deal and essentially steal from the criminals and keep the money for themselves. However, they do not realize that they may be biting more than they can chew, as that criminal has his eyes set on something more than just a quiet routine drug deal. But by then, it will be too late to back out. So, the first thing you need to know about the film is it's pretty long. It runs at 2.5 hours, but surprisingly engaging despite the runtime and the nature of the story. See, it doesn't really rush events. It takes a lot of time, taking it slow, doing the setup, showing how long and uneventful a stakeout can be, establishing the characters in the world of the film, and only for the final third act using that built up tension to finally explode it in the audience's face. I guess what surprised me most is that despite being uneventful for so long, it doesn't feel dragged out or boring. Somehow it remains interesting throughout and ends up being pretty well paced. I guess in this regard it is similar to another film from the same director, Bone Tomahawk, which also moves fairly slowly and uses most of its time for setup only to go completely wild in the final act. Apart from just the pacing, I have to say I also really liked the plot. I appreciated that it didn't feel the need to establish any of the characters involved as a pure good guy. You can make a case that each of these people involved are anti-heroes, and some of them are pretty much straight villains. There are things done in the film which are not for the faint of heart. It does get very brutal and shocking and cruel, and it's not afraid to not just imply but to directly show those things happening. I also really liked the look of the film, the sort of yellow hues permeating most of the frames, and the performances, particularly of the two cops played by Gibson and Vaughn. They really sell being these slimy, dirty cops that may think they're in the right, but are they really? The final act is also very well executed in terms of the mechanics of what is going on. So it feels like all the time there are three different players trying to outsmart each other and stay ahead of the other parties. And there is this endless back and forth of who actually has the upper hand. And as I'm saying, it's mostly about outsmarting. It's not a full-on action film, even if in the final act with shootouts all the time. Most of the conflict actually happens in the heads of the characters, I'd say. Having said all of that, I think the film isn't perfect. I certainly have some criticisms. I think there is one sequence around the middle part introducing a new character, a bank teller character, which I think was quite weird. And even though I understand its purpose, I believe it could have been done differently or cut for time without losing too much. I also think some of the dialogue was clunky, especially towards the beginning. The scenes with cops occasionally fell flat for me. And also the introduction of one of the criminals involved in the whole affair, while effective, is not really logical, I'd say, without spoiling too much. But even with all of these, I still enjoyed Dragged Across Concrete very much. It has a properly dirty feel to it, like you're watching a modern Western for grown-ups, where there is no nobility and honor and goodness, just selfishness and greed that eventually becomes the downfall of man. Solid film.